Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at Standard 7. This is going to be the first part of our EOC review. So we're just going to focus on Standard 7 today, and we're going to be working our way backwards, heading down to Standard 1. And what Standard 7 is going to have in it is mainly going to be about World War II and the Cold War. There will be a document attached to this for you to answer questions after you watch this video. You can also take notes too if you would like. I'm not going to tell you have to, but you do have to answer the questions at the end. Just make sure that you do that, and when we're done with the video, that you answer those questions and you turn those questions in. So, with that being said, let's start looking at what was in Standard 7. First thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the beginnings of World War II. And as the war begins, the United States is going to help out its allies. One of the ways that they're going to do this is through something called the Lend-Lease Act, where we would either lend the equipment to our allies or we would lease the equipment to our allies. And sometimes not even knowing whether we would ever get paid back for them. But this was Franklin Roosevelt's way to help out our allies, even though the United States is neutral at the beginning of World War II. Some highlights that you need to know as far as dates and battles in Europe would include, of course, the start of the war when Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. The event that brings the United States into the war, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt's Day That Would Live in Infamy speech. And then, of course, June 6, 1944, D-Day invasion. It's when the United States and its allies would land on Normandy to liberate Europe against the Germans at that point. The Germans' last counteroffensive against the Allies, last big counteroffensive against the Allies, is going to be the Battle of the Bulge, which would take place in late 1944, early 1945. Now that we've talked about Europe, let's look at some of the things that were going on in the Pacific. In the Pacific, the turning point of the war is going to occur at Midway. It's considered the turning point because the Japanese are going to lose 4 aircraft carriers, and this is going to allow the United States to go on the offensive against the Japanese in the Pacific. We're also going to have 2 big battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which was close to the islands of Japan, which they're part of that island chain. These were considered very deadly, and it showed that the Japanese were not willing to give up and they would fight to the death. This is eventually what's going to lead Harry Truman to use the atomic bombs in August of 1945 when he dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, one on Nagasaki. And this was Harry S. Truman's decision to use those bombs. Another important or pivotal role during World War II was the use of women and minorities during the war to fill some of those vacant spots that were left in the factories. These women and these minority workers would actually take up roles in those factories to help build tanks and airplanes and trucks and jeeps and so on to make sure that the war effort was getting what it needed. But after the war was over with, a lot of them were asked to go back home in the 1950s. And of course, the famous picture, Rosie the Riveter, here on this slide is one of the more iconic posters that was out during that period. One sad thing that occurs during World War II was the internment of the Japanese Americans living in the U.S. These Japanese Americans are going to be ordered into these camps called internment camps. And this was done through an executive order by Franklin Roosevelt called Executive Order 9066. It was challenged by Korematsu versus the United States. This was a court case that made it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule that these internment camps are constitutional, but later it would be overturned. After the war was over with, we get the Nuremberg War Trials. This is when the Allies are going to put the Nazi officers who were responsible for the Holocaust on trial. They called these crimes against humanity. A lot of these officers were either put to death or sentenced to life in prison. Of course, with the end of World War II, we get the start of the Cold War, and this is when Winston Churchill gives his famous Iron Curtain speech that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and it was dividing East and West. The eastern portion controlled by the Soviet Union, the western portion mainly dominated by Great Britain, the United States, and its allies. When we have these things like this, we call these nations that were going along with either the Soviet Union or the Allies, we would call these things satellite states, that they were doing the bidding of those other countries or that one particular country like the Soviet Union. The policy that was used to try to stop the spread of communism after World War II was the policy known as containment. The Truman Doctrine was issued too after World War II to help countries that possibly could fall to communism through either military or economic aid. The Marshall Plan was created by George Marshall. He issued this plan to give money to nations in Europe that were destroyed after World War II. So any nation was able to get that. Please don't get the two mixed up, Truman and Marshall. Know the differences in those in case those appear on the EOC. In the 1950s, we get the baby boom. We get the rock and roll era. The baby boom, of course, a lot of babies born after World War II is over with. It's explosion in the population. We get the emergence of the GI Bill, which was money for college for veterans and people in military services, loans to buy houses, and all sorts of things through the GI Bill. Television became huge after World War II. People began to see news for the first time and see things live. So it's going to change the way that we go about viewing things. Even as a consumer, seeing some of those things on television would spark interest to get people to go and buy things. The suburbs became huge after World War II in the United States. We saw these big suburbs or suburban areas emerge outside of cities. People began to move to those areas, and we sort of talked about that when we talked about urban flight a little bit. The interstate system emerges after World War II. Remember, the interstates were mainly designed because of fear of a military invasion by another country, so they were built for the military mainly and to help with trade and commerce. McCarthyism was also after World War II. We see Joseph McCarthy go after people within Congress and go after actors and all sorts of different people, saying that they were communists, but he created the Red Scare, which is actually Red Scare Part 2, which was a fear of a communist takeover within America. And because the United States lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation or complete destruction by nuclear bombs, people started using different types of drills, such as the duck and cover drill. They built bomb shelters, but all of these things occurred in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Early 1950, we get a showdown in Asia between the communists in North Korea and the U.S.-backed government in South Korea. After the war, the Korean Peninsula had been divided at the 38th parallel, which was the dividing line. North Korea would invade the South, only to be pushed back to that line, and they signed a truce, meaning to stop fighting at about that same spot. So the 38th parallel still divides North and South Korea to this day, and there was no official treaty ending this war. During the Cold War, we had problems with Cuba as well. A dictator had taken over in Cuba that wasn't friendly with the United States. His name is Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro began to support and listen to the Soviet Union. This is going to cause the United States to respond with the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was done by the CIA. It was an invasion of Cuba to try to go and get Castro. It fails. Later after that would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union is going to put nuclear weapons in Cuba and point them at the United States. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a U-2 spy plane was shot down when it seized these missiles over Cuba. But we knew the missiles were there due to these U-2 flights, and you see the U-2 plane down there in the bottom right-hand corner. The United States is going to respond by blockading the island of Cuba. This would last for 13 days, and eventually the Soviet Union, which is led by Nikita Khrushchev at this time, is going to back down and end the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Berlin, we also have problems during the Cold War. East Germany is mainly controlled by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. West Germany is controlled by Great Britain, France, and the United States after World War II. Eventually, West Germany becomes its own country, and East Germany becomes its own country, but it remained split. And East Germany was really a satellite state or a puppet nation of the Soviet Union during that whole period. Shortly after World War II had ended, the Soviets tried to get the United States and its allies to back out of Berlin, who was also split after World War II. So the way they do that is to blockade Berlin. The U.S. is going to organize airlift and drop supplies into the city of Berlin. This would eventually put an end to the blockade that the Soviets had put up. In 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, mainly to keep East Germans from defecting into West Germany. It came down in 1989. Okay, these are some practice questions. You might want to look at these questions. I'm just going to give you a second to look at each one. And this shows you the European recovery. It was probably the Marshall Plan. But you can look at it, read it, and then answer the question in your mind there. This is the first question. Second question, if you want to pause, you can. Question number 3. And question number 4. And that's going to do it for this review of Standard 7. Remember to answer the questions that are attached on a Google Doc to this video. So please make sure that you answer those and that you submit the answers to those questions after viewing the video. We will pick up with the next video, which will be Standard 6, as we're going in reverse. And hopefully this will help you in some way, and hopefully you'll get some things out of this after going through these videos. And I will catch you guys on the next one.